Smoke filled the great hall before anyone understood what was happening. One moment the musicians were playing and candles were burning along the walls of Ashcombe Manor. The next moment, a curtain caught fire near the tall windows, and the flames climbed faster than anyone could shout a warning. Duke Alaric Thornebury turned toward the sound of breaking glass. Guests were already running. A woman in a silver gown tripped near the staircase, and without thinking, he grabbed her arm and pulled her upright. "This way," he said, "not the front doors. They are already blocked." She did not argue. There was no time to argue. He pulled her through a side corridor, past a wall hanging that had already begun to smolder, down a narrow stone stairway that led below the house. The air grew cooler as they descended, and the roar of the fire faded into a dull, distant hum. They reached the wine cellar just as the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut behind them. Alaric turned back and pushed against it. It would not move. "The latch," the woman said, her voice tight. "It must have jammed when the frame heated." "You know a great deal about door latches for someone in a ballroom gown." "I know a great deal about many things, Your Grace." Something in the way she said his title made him look at her properly for the first time. The smoke had smeared her rouge and loosened strands of dark hair from its pins, but her face was unmistakable. He had seen it once before, in a portrait hanging in a house he had never wanted to enter. Seraphine Vayne, Duke Thornebury. She lifted her chin. "I would say it is a pleasure, but I do not lie to men I dislike." Of all the women in that house, of all the strangers he might have saved from the fire, fate had handed him the one person whose family name had been poison in his own household since before he could walk. The Vaynes and the Thorneburys had not spoken a civil word to each other in nearly 20 years. His grandfather had died believing Edmund Vayne's father had stolen land that belonged to the Thornebury name by right. Alaric had grown up hearing that story at every dinner, every holiday, every time a Vayne carriage happened to pass through the village. And now he was standing in a locked cellar with Edmund Vayne's daughter, while the house above them burned. "We need to find another way out," he said, turning from her deliberately. "There isn't one. Not from here. This cellar was built to store wine, not to be a second staircase. Then we will make one." He moved along the stone wall, feeling for any gap, any weakness, anything that might lead upward. The shelves around them were heavy with old bottles, some of them older than either of their fathers. Somewhere above, muffled shouting told him the fire had reached the upper floor. "They will notice we are missing," Seraphine said. "Someone will come." "Will they? In all that chaos, who is counting names?" She did not answer that. He heard her breathing change, quick and shallow, and when he looked back, she had pressed her palm flat against the wall as if she could feel the heat of the fire through solid stone. "You are frightened," he said. It was not an accusation. It surprised him how little pleasure it gave him to say it. "I am calculating," she corrected. "There is a difference." "Calculating what?" "How much air is in a room this size, and how long it lasts if the fire above uses it faster than we do." Alaric stared at her. "That is a strange thing to know. My father taught me to think about rooms the way soldiers think about ground, where the exits are, where the weaknesses are. He said a woman who only knows how to smile at a ball is a woman who dies in a fire." "Your father sounds like a pleasant man to grow up with." "He is a better man than the ones who spread lies about him at every dinner table in this county." The words landed harder than either of them expected. For a moment, neither spoke. The distant sound of the fire seemed to fill the silence between them, crackling somewhere above their heads, like a living thing pacing back and forth. "You know nothing about my family," Alaric said quietly. "I know what your family says about mine. I have heard it my whole life. The Vaynes are thieves. The Vaynes cannot be trusted. The Vaynes stole land that was never theirs to take." She stepped closer, and the candlelight from the one lamp still burning on the wall caught the anger in her eyes. "Tell me, Your Grace, have you ever once asked whether any of it was true? My grandfather was not a liar. Neither was mine. And yet here we are, trapped in the same room, because both of them decided that hating each other mattered more than telling their grandchildren the truth. Alaric turned away from her and pressed his shoulder against the door again, more out of frustration than any real hope that it would move. It didn't. Somewhere far above, a beam cracked and fell with a sound like thunder, and dust sifted down through the gaps in the ceiling boards. "We are not getting out that way," he admitted. "Then we look for another." They searched the cellar together, moving along opposite walls, checking every shadow the single lamp could not reach. It was Seraphine who found it first, a narrow gap behind a stack of empty barrels, a passage that had clearly not been used in years. "Here," she called. "It goes somewhere. I can feel air moving." Alaric crossed to her side and crouched to look. The gap was low and dark, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. It smelled of damp stone and something colder underneath. Water, perhaps, moving somewhere unseen. "It could lead nowhere," he said. "It could lead out. It could also lead to a flooded tunnel that drowns us both before the fire ever reaches us." Seraphine looked at him, and for the first time since the door had jammed shut, something like real fear crossed her face, quickly hidden again behind that same sharp composure. "Do you have a better plan, Your Grace?" He did not. He hated that he did not. "We wait a few minutes," he said. Listen, if the fire is put out, someone will come looking. If it isn't, we go through that gap and hope for the best." She nodded, and they settled into an uneasy silence, sitting apart from each other on two crates that had clearly once held bottles now broken somewhere in the dark. The lamp flickered low, and neither of them spoke of feuds or fathers or fires for a long moment. "Why did you pull me out?" Seraphine asked eventually. "You did not know who I was. You were falling. I would have done the same for anyone." "Would you? Even if you had known?" Alaric did not answer right away. The honest answer troubled him more than he wanted to admit, and the cellar felt smaller for it, the air thicker, the silence between them heavier than smoke. Somewhere above, the shouting had grown fainter, and for the first time since the fire began, Alaric allowed himself to wonder if the two of them were now, in every sense that mattered, entirely alone. "I don't know," he said finally. "And that troubles me more than the fire does." Seraphine looked at him for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether he meant it. Then she looked away, toward the narrow black gap behind the barrels, and said nothing at all. The lamp flickered once, twice, and steadied. Above them, the house that had welcomed them both that evening groaned like something wounded, and neither of them moved to speak again until the sound had passed. The lamp gave out an hour later. One moment, there was a small, steady flame throwing shadows across the cellar walls. The next moment, there was only darkness, thick and complete, the kind that made the air itself feel heavier. "Alaric," Seraphine's voice came from somewhere to his left, tighter than before. "I am here. Do not move. There is broken glass between us." "I know where the glass is. I am the one who dropped a bottle 10 minutes ago, if you recall." "I recall you claiming it slipped." "It did slip. Bottles do not usually slip out of hands that are, as you put it, calculating." Even in the dark, he could hear the small huff of breath that might have been a laugh if either of them had been willing to admit it. He reached out carefully and found the edge of a shelf, then the crate she had been sitting on, and finally her sleeve, cool and slightly damp from the cellar air. "Stay close," he said. "If the water is rising in that passage, we need to know before we commit to it." Water does not usually announce itself politely. No, but it leaves signs, a smell, a sound. They moved together toward the narrow gap behind the barrels, Alaric's hand still loosely around her sleeve, more for the certainty of not losing each other in the blackness than for any comfort in the gesture. When they reached the opening, he crouched low and listened. Somewhere beyond the gap, water moved. Not a flood, not yet. A slow trickle, patient and steady, the kind of sound that could mean an hour of safety or a lifetime, depending on how fast it grew. "We go now," Seraphine said, "before it decides for us." Or we wait for rescue. Rescue that has not come in over an hour while a house burns above our heads? I would rather trust a tunnel I can feel than a door that has not opened once since it jammed. Alaric wanted to argue, if only because arguing with her had become, in the strangest way, a kind of steadiness in the dark. But she was not wrong, and he knew it. "I go first," he said, "because you are the Duke, or because you think I cannot manage a crawl through a tunnel. Because if there is nothing on the other side but a wall, I would rather be the one who finds that out." She was quiet for a moment. "That is not the answer I expected. I am full of surprises tonight." He got down on his hands and knees and felt his way into the gap. The stone was rough and cold beneath his palms, and the passage narrowed almost immediately, forcing his shoulders together as he crawled forward inch by inch. Behind him he heard Seraphine follow, her breathing quick but controlled, the sound of her skirts dragging against stone. "Talk to me," she said, from somewhere behind him. "I would rather hear your voice than the water." "About what?" "Anything, your childhood, your horse. I do not care. Just talk." Alaric considered this as he felt his way forward, one hand finding a jagged outcrop of rock, the other bracing against the tunnel wall. "I had a horse named Merit. My father gave him to me when I was 8, and I fell off him so many times that the stablemaster began keeping a tally on the wall of the barn." "How many falls?" 41, by the time Merit died of old age. "That is a remarkable number of falls for a duke." "I was not always a duke. I was, for most of my childhood, simply a boy who fell off horses." Behind him, in the dark, he heard something that might have been the ghost of a real laugh, quickly swallowed. It did something strange to the tight, cold space around them, made it feel briefly less like a grave and more like simply a passage between two places. The tunnel bent sharply to the left, and Alaric's hand found empty air where he expected stone. He paused. "What is it?" Seraphine asked. "A branch. The tunnel splits here." "Which way feels right?" "None of it feels right. We are crawling through a hole under a burning house." Alaric. It was the first time she had used his given name without the title attached, and something about hearing it in the dark, in her voice, low and urgent, made him choose faster than he otherwise might have. "Left," he said. "The air feels less still." They crawled on, and the passage grew tighter still before it began, mercifully, to widen. Alaric felt the ceiling lift away from his back, felt the space open into something almost large enough to stand in, and then his hand found the edge of a step. "There are stairs," he said. "Where do they lead?" "I do not know, but they lead somewhere, and somewhere is better than here." He rose carefully, testing the stone beneath his boots, before trusting his full weight to it, and reached back to help Seraphine up beside him. Her hand found his in the dark, small and cold, and for a moment neither of them let go. "How many steps?" she asked. "I cannot count what I cannot see." "Then we count together. 1, 2. They climbed in the dark, calling out numbers between them like a strange, quiet game, and Alaric found that the counting steadied something in his chest that fear had been pulling loose since the lamp went out. At 11, his outstretched hand found wood instead of stone, a door, warped with age but solid. "A door," he said. "Locked?" He pushed. It groaned, resisted, then gave way all at once, and cool night air rushed in to meet them, carrying with it the distant, acrid smell of smoke and the sound of rain. They stepped through into what had once been a gardener's shed, half collapsed, open to a sky churning with storm clouds. Rain fell in heavy sheets beyond the broken roof, and somewhere in the distance, through the trees, the manor still glowed orange against the dark. "We are not out," Alaric said, looking at the storm and the flooded grounds beyond the shed. "We are simply somewhere else that is not safe." Seraphine stepped past him to the shed's broken doorway and looked out at the rain-soaked grounds, the water already pooling ankle-deep across the lawn. "The bridge to the main road will be flooded. I saw it from the carriage on the way in. It sits low, and this rain has been falling for hours. Then we are trapped here until morning, regardless of what door we found. It seems that way." He looked at her properly then, soaked and streaked with soot, her fine gown ruined beyond repair, and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with fear of fire or flood. "You did not have to follow me into that tunnel," he said. "I did not have much choice, unless you intended to leave me in a burning cellar. I would not have left you." "No," she said quietly, studying him in the dim orange light thrown by the distant fire. "I do not believe you would have." Thunder rolled somewhere over the hills, and the rain came harder, and the two of them stood in the ruin of a garden shed with nowhere else to go until the sun rose, enemies by blood, and for reasons neither of them could yet explain, no longer quite enemies at all. The shed was not built to survive a storm like this. Rain came through the broken roof in long, cold ropes, and within a quarter hour the floor had turned to mud beneath their boots. Alaric found an old workbench pushed against the driest wall and dragged it toward the center of the room, clearing broken pots and rusted tools to the side. "Sit," he said. "The ground is worse than the bench." Seraphine did not argue. She lowered herself onto the bench, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold, and Alaric sat beside her, close enough to share what little warmth two soaked bodies could offer each other. "We cannot stay here until morning," he said. "This shed will not hold against the wind much longer." "Do you see another option, Your Grace? A carriage waiting politely at the door." "No need for the title, not tonight." "What would you prefer? Alaric seems too familiar for a man whose family calls mine thieves at every dinner table." He turned to look at her, rain dripping from his hair, and something in her tone, sharp but tired, made him decide the conversation they had been circling since the cellar could not wait any longer. "Tell me," he said, "what really happened between our grandfathers? You said there was a truth I had not heard." Seraphine was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he thought she might refuse. Then she drew a slow breath, as though gathering something heavy before she set it down. "My grandfather did not steal the Thornebury land," she said. "He won it, in a card game, a private one, between friends, or men who called themselves friends. Your grandfather lost 3 parcels of land to mine over the course of one very long night, and in the morning, when he was sober and ashamed, he refused to honor the debt." Alaric felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the rain. "My grandfather did not gamble." "Your grandfather gambled a great deal, according to my father, who heard it from his own father, who was there in the room. It was well known in certain circles. It was simply never spoken of at Thornebury dinner tables, because a story where your family loses land through drink and pride is a much harder one to tell than a story where the Vaynes are simply thieves. You expect me to believe my grandfather invented an entire history to protect his pride. I expect nothing from you. I am only telling you what I know. And how do you know it? Whispers passed down through a family with every reason to make itself look better than it was." Seraphine's eyes flashed, and for a moment the fragile truce between them threatened to collapse entirely. "Because my grandfather kept the letter, Your Grace. The one your grandfather wrote when he finally admitted, in private, what he had done. It still exists. My father has it, locked away, because he always believed that one day it might matter more than the silence had. A letter that conveniently only you have ever seen. I did not say I have seen it. I said my father has it, which means I have only your word, which is worth exactly as much as your grandfather's word was worth to mine, apparently." The words landed hard, and Alaric stood abruptly, pacing the narrow width of the shed, rain hammering the broken roof above him like something demanding to be let in. He wanted to reject everything she had said. It would have been easier. It would have let him keep the version of his family he had grown up believing, the version where the Thorneburys were wronged and the Vaynes were the wrongdoers, where 20 years of cold silence at every gathering had at least meant something. But he thought of his grandfather's portrait in the long gallery at Thornbury Hall, the tightness around the painted eyes that he had never quite been able to name. He thought of the way his father spoke of the old man, only in careful, measured tones, never with warmth, always with a strange kind of duty. He thought of how quickly, how completely, the story of the Vayne thieves had always been told, without any mention of cards, or debts, or a single long night that might explain everything. Why would he keep a letter like that? Alaric said finally, if it only proves his own family's shame. A card game they refused to speak of either. Because my grandfather did not want money from your family, Duke Thornebury. He did not even want the land back, not truly. He wanted the truth to exist somewhere, in writing, in case a day ever came when someone was willing to hear it. And you believe that day is tonight. I believe fate has a strange sense of timing, Seraphine said, and very little patience for waiting. Alaric stopped pacing and looked at her, soaked and pale in the dim orange light, still leaking faintly through the shed's broken window from the distant, dying fire. He wanted to walk away from the conversation entirely, to insist she was lying, to hold on to the simple, familiar shape of his family's grievance a little longer. Instead, he asked the question that mattered more than any other. If this letter is real, why has your father never used it? Why keep silent for 20 years, if the truth could have ended the feud at any moment? Seraphine's composure finally cracked, just slightly at the edges. Because my father is dying, Duke Thornebury. He has been dying for the better part of a year, and the physicians say he has perhaps 2 more months, if he is fortunate. And in all that time, he has told me he would rather leave this world with the truth still locked away than have it dismissed by a Thornebury who calls him a liar to his face while he is too weak to defend himself. The rain seemed suddenly very loud in the silence that followed. I did not know, Alaric said quietly. Why would you? It is not the sort of thing anyone tells the enemy's son at a dinner party. He sat back down beside her, slower this time, the anger that had carried him across the shed draining away into something closer to grief, though grief for what, exactly, he could not have said. Grief for a grandfather he had trusted without question. Grief for 20 years spent hating a family that might have done nothing more than tell the truth and be disbelieved for it. I want to see the letter, he said, not because I doubt you, because I need to see it with my own eyes, if it exists, before I can stand in front of my own family and say the story we have always told is wrong. That is fair, Seraphine said, more fair than I expected from you, if I am honest. You expected less of me. I expected the man your family has always described, cold, certain, unwilling to bend. And what do you find instead? She studied him for a long moment, rain dripping steadily from a crack in the roof between them, the fire on the horizon finally beginning to dim as the storm smothered it at last. I find a man crawling through tunnels and sitting in ruined sheds, asking questions he was raised never to ask. That is not nothing. A gust of wind tore at the shed's broken door, and for a moment it seemed the whole structure might finally give way entirely. Alaric rose and pressed his shoulder against the door frame, bracing it as best he could, and Seraphine moved beside him without being asked, adding her own weight against the wood. We cannot survive the night in here, he said, straining against the frame as wind howled outside. The shed will not hold. There was a gamekeeper's cottage, Seraphine said, raising her voice over the storm. I saw it from the carriage, further along the tree line, before the road curved toward the manor. If it still stands, it will be sturdier than this. In this rain, in the dark, we could walk in circles for an hour and never find it. Then we had better start walking before the hour becomes 2. He looked at her, drenched and determined, refusing entirely to be the frightened woman his family's stories might have painted her as, and felt something shift further inside him, quiet and unwelcome and entirely undeniable. Stay close, he said. If we lose each other in this, we will not find one another again until morning. I have no intention of losing you, Duke Thornebury. She caught his eye, something almost like challenge in her expression. Not after everything it has taken to keep you alive tonight. They stepped out together into the storm, the shed groaning and finally collapsing behind them as they moved away from it, swallowed almost instantly by rain and darkness and the distant orange glow of a house still smoldering somewhere behind the trees. The ground had turned to a shallow, freezing river beneath their feet, and twice Seraphine stumbled, caught both times by Alaric's arm before she could fall. The wind drove the rain sideways, stinging their faces, and conversation became impossible beneath the roar of the storm. They simply walked, hand in hand, now without either of them remembering exactly when that had happened, following the dark line of trees Seraphine had marked from the carriage window hours before the world had changed shape entirely. It was nearly an hour before a low, square shadow emerged from the darkness ahead, a stone cottage with a sagging roof but solid walls, a thin curl of smoke rising from what must have been a banked fire left burning by whoever tended the grounds. "There," Seraphine gasped, pointing through the rain. "There, Alaric, that is it." They ran the last stretch together, boots sliding in the mud, and did not stop moving until the cottage door was shut behind them and the storm was, for the moment, locked outside where it belonged. The cottage was small, one room with a low fire banked in the hearth, and it was the warmest either of them had felt in hours. Seraphine knelt by the fire, coaxing it back to life with a poker she found leaning against the stone, while Alaric checked the shuttered windows against the wind still howling outside. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was perhaps nothing left to say that would not sound smaller than the night they had just survived. It was the first gray light of dawn, filtering weakly through the shutters, that finally brought voices from outside. Men's voices, calling names, calling his name, and Alaric rose quickly and threw open the door to find a small search party picking its way through the flooded grounds, lanterns held high despite the growing daylight. "Your Grace." The lead man, a broad-shouldered steward named Everett, splashed forward through the mud, with visible relief on his face. "We feared the worst. The fire took the east wing entirely before the rain put it down." "We are both alive," Alaric said. "Seraphine Vayne was with me. She needs to be brought back safely, and quickly." Everett's expression shifted, just slightly, at the name, and behind him Alaric saw another rider approaching, a man on horseback whose face he recognized instantly, and whose presence made his stomach tighten with a feeling that had nothing to do with the storm. His cousin, Cedric Thornebury, dismounted with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world generally arranged itself to his advantage. Alaric. Cedric's smile did not reach his eyes as they settled on Seraphine, standing now in the cottage doorway behind him. "And the Vayne girl, what extraordinary luck, that you should both survive the night together." "It was not luck, Cedric. It was a fire, and a flood, and very little choice in the matter." "Of course." Cedric's gaze lingered a moment too long on Seraphine before returning to his cousin. "Still, it does present an interesting opportunity, does it not? Edmund Vayne's own daughter, delivered into our hands by nothing more than an unfortunate storm. She is not a prisoner, Cedric." "No one said prisoner." Cedric's voice remained light, almost pleasant, which somehow made the words worse. "I only mean that with Lord Vayne so unwell, and his daughter here, under our protection, one might imagine a great many arrangements becoming suddenly possible. The disputed land, for instance. A signature obtained under grateful circumstances is still a signature." Alaric felt something cold and sharp cut through the exhaustion of the night. "You intend to use her father's illness, and this storm, to force a settlement on land you have no rightful claim to. I intend to secure what our family has been owed for 20 years, using whatever circumstances happen to fall into our lap. I would think you, of all people, would understand the value of not wasting an opportunity." Seraphine stepped forward before Alaric could respond, her chin lifted, despite the mud and rain still clinging to her ruined gown. "My father is dying, sir. If you imagine grief and exhaustion will make me careless enough to sign away land my family has held for generations, you have badly misjudged me." "We shall see," Cedric said, unbothered, "once you are safely returned to Thornbury Hall, where I imagine we can discuss matters at greater leisure." "She is not going to Thornbury Hall," Alaric said. She is going home, to her father, now while there is still time for her to see him. Cedric's smile finally faded into something harder. You would let her walk away, after everything I have just explained to you. After 20 years of waiting for exactly this kind of opening, I would let her walk away, because it is the right thing to do, and because everything I learned from her last night has convinced me our family's claim on that land was never as clean as we were raised to believe. The words hung in the wet morning air between them, and Alaric watched something shift in his cousin's face, surprise giving way quickly to something colder and more calculating. You cannot be serious. I have never been more serious in my life. There was a letter, Cedric, our grandfather's own admission, that the land was lost fairly, in a card game he later refused to honor. I intend to see that letter with my own eyes, and if it says what I believe it says, I intend to correct 20 years of a lie. A lie your own grandfather told to protect this family. A lie that has cost us any claim to honesty for 2 decades. I will not add another day to it. Everett, standing quietly between the 2 cousins, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The other men in the search party kept their eyes carefully on the ground, unwilling to be caught taking a side in a quarrel between the Duke and his own blood. You would choose her then, Cedric said, his voice low now, dangerous in a way it had not been a moment before. The daughter of the family that has humiliated ours for a generation. You would choose her over your own house. I would choose the truth over a lie, Cedric. If that happens to align with what is right for Seraphine and her family, then so be it. Seraphine, standing beside him now, spoke before Cedric could respond. My father does not have the luxury of waiting for this family to decide whether honesty suits its purposes. I need to go to him. Now, whatever quarrel you 2 have over land and pride can wait for a day when his life is not measured in hours. Cedric's jaw tightened, but something in her voice, steady despite everything, seemed to give even him pause. Fine, he said finally. Go to your father, Miss Vayne, but know that this conversation is far from finished, Alaric. The family will not simply accept you handing away a claim 2 decades in the making because of 1 night and 1 unproven letter. Then the family can bring their objections to me directly, Alaric said. I am still the Duke, whatever else changes today. Cedric mounted his horse without another word, wheeling it hard through the mud before riding off toward the smoking ruin of Ashcombe Manor, and Everett moved quickly to arrange a carriage, sending one of the younger men ahead to ready horses for the road to the Vayne estate. Thank you, Seraphine said quietly, once Cedric had gone and the men had moved off to prepare the horses. For that, all of it. Do not thank me yet. Your father's letter may prove nothing, and my family's reaction to what I said this morning will likely be far worse than anything Cedric threatened. I know what it costs a man like you to say the things you just said, in front of his own kin. It costs less than I expected, Alaric admitted, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that it was true. I have spent 20 years certain of something that may never have been true at all. Saying so aloud felt less like losing something and more like finally putting down a weight I did not know I was carrying. The carriage arrived within the half hour, and as they climbed inside, soaked and exhausted and changed in ways neither of them could yet fully name, Seraphine turned to him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something unguarded, something that looked almost like hope. Will you come with me, she asked, to see my father, to see the letter, if he is willing to show it. I would not ask you to face that alone, not after last night. That is not what I asked, Alaric. He looked at her, at the rain still dripping from her hair, at the exhaustion and the grief and the stubborn hope all fighting for space in her expression, and understood suddenly and completely that whatever answer he gave in this carriage would decide far more than a single visit to a dying man's bedside. Yes, he said, I will come, whatever the letter says, whatever it costs me at Thornbury Hall, I will come. The carriage rolled forward through the wet gray morning, carrying them both away from the ruin of the night behind them and toward a truth that neither of their families had been brave enough to face in 20 long years. The Vayne estate sat quiet under the gray morning sky. The storm finally passed, leaving behind only puddles and broken branches scattered across the long drive. Alaric had never set foot on Vayne land in his life. He had grown up close enough to see its rooftops from certain hills near Thornebury Hall, close enough to know every rumor told about the family within its walls, but he had never once crossed the boundary that separated the two estates. Doing so now, sitting beside Seraphine in a carriage still damp from the night before, felt like crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. "He will not be pleased to see you," Seraphine said quietly, as the house came into view. "Whatever the letter says, 20 years of hatred does not vanish because his daughter survived a storm with a Thornberry. I do not expect him to be pleased. I only hope he will let me see the truth for myself." The carriage stopped, and a housekeeper met them at the door, her face pale with worry that had clearly been building long before their arrival. "Miss Vayne, thank goodness, your father took a turn in the night. The physician is with him now." Seraphine's composure, which had held through fire and flood and threats from Alaric's own cousin, finally cracked at those words. She was moving before the housekeeper finished speaking, climbing the stairs 2 at a time, and Alaric followed close behind, uncertain of his welcome, but unwilling to let her face this alone. Lord Edmund Vayne lay propped against a bank of pillows in a room that smelled of medicine and burning herbs, his face gray and thin in a way that spoke plainly of the illness Seraphine had described in the ruined shed hours before. His eyes, though, were sharp and alert, and they fixed on Alaric the moment he stepped through the doorway. "A Thornbury," Edmund said, his voice thin but steady. "In my own house. I did not think I would live to see such a strange morning." "My lord." Alaric bowed, awkward in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. "I would not have come uninvited, but your daughter asked, and I did not have it in me to refuse her. My daughter has always had a talent for making difficult men do reasonable things." Edmund's gaze shifted to Seraphine, softening considerably. "You are soaked through, child, and look as though you have not slept." "There was a fire, Papa. At the Ashcombe gathering, Alaric pulled me out before I understood what was happening, and we were trapped together until this morning." Edmund's eyes returned to Alaric, weighing him carefully. "And in all those hours trapped together, what did my enemy's grandson decide to discuss?" "The letter," Alaric said. "Seraphine told me what she knew of the card game, and of my grandfather's admission afterward. I told her I could not simply believe her word alone, however much I wanted to. I needed to see it myself." For a long moment, Edmund said nothing, his gaze moving between Alaric and his daughter, as though measuring something in the space between them that neither had spoken aloud. Then, slowly, he reached toward the small table beside his bed and withdrew a key from beneath the pillow, offering it to Seraphine without a word. "The box in my study, second drawer of the desk, beneath the false bottom your grandmother had built. Bring it to me." Seraphine took the key and hurried from the room, and Edmund's attention settled fully on Alaric in her absence. "You understand," the old man said, "that showing you this letter changes nothing about 20 years of silence. It does not undo the whispers, the insults, the doors closed to my family at every gathering in this county." "No," Alaric agreed, "it does not, but it can stop those 20 years from becoming 40, if I am willing to carry the truth back to my own family, whatever the cost to me." "And are you willing?" "I have already told my cousin as much, this very morning. He did not take it well." Edmund studied him a moment longer, something that might have been the ghost of respect flickering behind his tired eyes. "Your grandfather was a proud man. Prouder than was good for him. I do not think he ever intended the lie to last 20 years. I think he told it once, in shame, and found it easier each time after that to let it stand than to admit what one bad night had cost him." "No, it does not, but I find, strangely, that I would rather hear a Thornbury admit that than spend whatever days remain to me still waiting for an apology that never comes." Seraphine returned moments later, carrying a small wooden box, and set it carefully on the bed beside her father. Edmund's hands, thin and trembling slightly, worked the lock and lifted the lid to reveal a single folded letter, the the paper yellowed with age, the wax seal long since broken. "Read it," Edmund said, holding it out to Alaric. "You said you needed to see it with your own eyes. Here it is." Alaric took the letter with hands that were not entirely steady and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same careful, slanted script he had seen on countless old documents at Thornbury Hall, the same hand that had signed his grandfather's portrait in the Long Gallery. The letter spoke exactly as Seraphine had described, an admission, written in evident shame, of a card game lost fairly over the course of one long drunken night, and a refusal afterward, born of pride and fear, of how the loss would look to a family that valued its name above almost everything else. It spoke of a lie constructed carefully in the weeks that followed, a story of theft invented to protect a reputation that a single honest night had nearly cost him. Alaric read it twice before he trusted himself to speak. "It is real," he said quietly. "Every word of it is exactly what you told me, Seraphine. I did not lie to you. No, you did not, and I am sorry, more than I know how to say, that it took a fire, and a flood, and a night trap together for me to finally hear it." Edmund watched the two of them with an expression that had softened considerably since Alaric first entered the room. "What do you intend to do now, Duke Thornebury, with the truth sitting in your hands?" "I intend to take it back to my own house," Alaric said, "and read it aloud in front of every member of my family who has spent 20 years believing a lie my grandfather told to protect his pride. I intend to return the disputed land to your family, publicly, with no conditions and no arrangements sought in exchange, and I intend, if you will permit it, to continue seeing your daughter, not because a storm trapped us together, but because I have come to know her as someone I do not wish to stop knowing." Seraphine turned to him, something unguarded crossing her tired, soot-streaked face. Edmund, watching them both, allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "You are either very brave, Duke Thornebury, or very foolish. My daughter has never had patience for foolish men. Then I hope, for both our sakes, that I have chosen the right path." 2 weeks later, Alaric stood in the Long Gallery at Thornbury Hall, the letter in his hand, his family gathered before him with expressions ranging from confusion to open anger. Cedric stood near the back, arms crossed, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. "You cannot simply hand back land that has been ours for 20 years, Cedric said, based on one letter that could easily be forged. "It is not forged," Alaric said. "I had it examined by the same solicitor who handles our family's most sensitive affairs. The hand is unmistakably our grandfather's, and the wax bears his personal seal, the one kept locked in his own study until his death. There is no forgery here, Cedric, only 20 years of a lie this family found more comfortable than the truth." A murmur passed through the gathered relatives, some clearly troubled, others simply uncertain how to respond to a duke unmaking his own family's story in front of them. "Our grandfather was ashamed," Alaric continued, "of a single night's foolishness, and rather than face that shame, he built an entire history of blame around it. We have spent 20 years hating a family for a crime our own blood invented. I will not spend another day continuing that lie, whatever it costs this house in pride or in land." "And what of our claim?" an older cousin asked, "to the reputation this family has built on that same story." "Our reputation," Alaric said, "will survive far better built on honesty than it ever has on a lie we were too proud to correct. I would rather this family be known, from today forward, as one capable of admitting a wrong, than one that spent 2 more decades pretending it never happened." Cedric said nothing further, though the look he gave his cousin promised the argument was far from finished. But the older members of the family, the ones who remembered enough of the grandfather in question to recognize the shape of pride when they saw it, said nothing to contradict him either. The land was returned to the Vayne family within the month, quietly, with none of the arrangements Cedric had once hoped to extract from a grieving daughter. Edmund Vayne, against all expectation, lingered longer than the physicians had predicted, as though the settling of an old debt had given him some small reserve of strength he had not expected to find. Alaric visited often in the weeks that followed, and it was on one of those visits, sitting beside Seraphine in the same garden where her mother had once grown roses, before the feud had made even the exchange of cut flowers between the two families impossible, that he finally asked the question that had been forming in him since the night of the fire. "I do not know how to court you properly," he admitted. "I have spent so long being taught that your family was an enemy that I never learned how to simply be a man who admires a woman." "You have managed well enough so far," Seraphine said, "for a man who claims to have no experience in the matter." "I mean it seriously, Seraphine. I would like to spend considerably more time in your company, without a fire or a flood forcing the matter." She studied him for a long moment, the autumn sun catching the last of the season's roses behind her, and something in her expression finally, fully, let go of 20 years of inherited caution. "I would like that as well, Alaric, though I will admit, our first night together set a rather dramatic standard for every evening that follows. I intend to disappoint you thoroughly then. I plan for every evening after this one to be entirely without fire, flood, or collapsing sheds." "How disappointing," she said, though her smile suggested otherwise entirely. Edmund Vayne lived to see his daughter married the following spring, in a ceremony held on the very boundary line that had once separated two feuding estates, now simply a garden path lined with roses from both houses, planted together for the first time in 20 years. Cedric did not attend, though most of the family did, standing witness to the quiet, unlikely end of a hatred that had outlived any honest reason for its existence. And when Alaric took Seraphine's hand before the assembled guests of both families, he thought of the burning hall, the locked cellar door, the tunnel in the dark, and the letter that had finally, after 20 years, told the truth, loud enough for everyone to hear. It had taken a single night of fire and flood to unmake 2 decades of inherited hatred. It took considerably longer, in the years that followed, for the Thornebury and Vayne names to be spoken together without a trace of old bitterness. But it happened, slowly, garden by garden, dinner by dinner, until the children born to Alaric and Seraphine grew up never once hearing the story of a feud at all, only the story of a fire that had, against every expectation, brought 2 enemies home to each other.